There we go. Hello, welcome to our fifth webinar in photographic process identification. This series is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. My name is Alice Carver-Cubic, and this webinar is being recorded and it will be available online. So this is part 2 of the two-part methodology for process identification series. The purpose of creating a methodology and a controlled vocabulary specific to photographic process identification is to simplify process ID. The idea is you don't have to be an expert. Once you know what to look for and how to look, you can pair these visual observations with a reference resource like Graphics Atlas. Last time, I made the analogy to plant identification. So you might observe leaf shape and color characteristics of a plant, and then use your plant reference guide to find out that it's poison ivy you're standing in. So like any skill, process identification takes practice. My goal is to give you tools and resources to help you along. I'll review the method of looking and the vocabulary we discussed last month, and then I'll show you how to apply it to the web resource Graphics Atlas. So last month, I used these 4 object examples to illustrate how to approach process identification and what key identifying features to look for. But I left you with a cliffhanger. We didn't identify the processes. What are these objects? So after I review the methodology and the vocabulary, we're going to revisit these objects and use Graphics Atlas to identify them. So in review, there are 3 methods of looking. There's the object view, the surface view, and the magnification view. With each view, we look for key identifying features specific to that method of looking. We have created these visual identification guides to define the key identifying features. So this is our controlled vocabulary specific to process identification. Each identification feature has been given a vocabulary term and then visually defined. I'll briefly describe each one of these ID guides, and then I'll show you where you can find them in Graphics Atlas in a little bit. So making these guides was a little bit like making a style guide for cataloging collections. We established a vocabulary and then we defined each term, and we'll consistently use the terms in our identification. Okay, so with the object view, what we're looking for are the type of primary support, the image color, and if there's any image deterioration we can use for identification. You may also look for clues within the image or clues that are written or printed on the object to narrow down a date range or process possibility. The most common primary support is paper, but photographs can also be on plastic, glass, metal, ceramic, fabric, and even leather. The next key identifying feature is image color or tone. Is your image monochromatic? If so, what color is it? Or is it full color, or has it been hand colored? So here's our visual identification guide for color. Each image color is visually defined with a series of images and a color bar showing a range within each color category. This is the vocabulary we will use to describe color. I also want you to notice the lighting angle symbol at the top of the guide right here. This indicates that you will need 45-degree or even illumination at the object view level. So this is your little hint about what level we're looking at. This is the object view even illumination. We will also try to determine if there's any image deterioration that can be a key identifying feature. And again, here's the guide for that. Once we're satisfied with our object view observations, we'll move on to the surface view. And so here we're looking for surface sheen characteristics. Surface sheen is broken down into 4 sheens. So our vocabularies are matte, semi-matte, glossy, and high gloss, all of which are visually defined. The guide also has surface sheen characteristics that are identifying features for some processes, like differential gloss, iridescence, or silver mirroring and bronzing. Moving on to the magnification view. When we use magnification, we're looking for image structure and layer structure features. The tools we need are a 10x loupe and a pocket microscope. If you're lucky enough to have a stereo microscope, you can use this instead. There is a range of pocket microscopes which have a range of possible magnification levels, anywhere from 30 times magnification to 50 times magnification and more. The one illustrated here in the center is sold by Carson, and this is the one that I use. It offers magnification of about 50x and up. We can see differing levels of detail as we increase magnification. With 10x magnification, we can determine if our image is continuous in tone. We may be able to see pigment particles, or our image may be patterned, suggesting it's photomechanical or digital. With the pattern images, we may not be able to see the individual dots or whatever is making up that image easily, but we can see if a print with a halftone pattern has, for example, an AM or an FM screen. With 30x magnification, we can see these features more clearly. Pigment particles will be easier to see, and those patterns are better visually defined. And again, this is our visual vocabulary for our image structure. Is it continuous in tone? Are the pigment particles? Is it patterned? The pattern image structures are examples. Every possible structure that is used to print a photograph is not on the guide. You may come across a dot structure that's not illustrated here. The point is to recognize that it's a pattern and it's not continuous in tone. So again, don't look for like a one-for-one comparison of the pattern you see with the guide. Just recognize like, yeah, it's made up of dots or squiggles or squares or whatever. With higher magnification of 50x, we can see even more information. With this level of magnification, we may be able to see if there is what we have called image grain. So now we have a new vocabulary word, image grain. An example are dye clouds, which are the result of image formation, the chromogenic process. And again, those image making elements of photomechanical and digital processes are easier to see. With this level of magnification, you might be able to determine if dots were produced by letterpress or offset lithography, for example. So you can really begin to see clearly the way these sort of dots are formed. And finally, with the magnification and raking light, we can look for clues that give us an idea of the layer structure of the print. If you struggle with layer structure, you're not alone. Just keep practicing, and we'll keep talking about this. And again, our vocabulary terms is where can you see the paper fibers, and where is the image in relationship to the paper fibers? Alternately, you can always look where there's areas of possible damage to see if you can determine how many layers there are. So hopefully you remember all of that from last month. Okay, so now that we've reviewed, let's go to Graphics Atlas. The URL is www.graphicsatlas.org. I'll give you a quick tour of the site. I have a feeling that most of you are somewhat familiar with Graphics Atlas already. I'll point out some of the cool features and discuss how to apply our identification methodology and vocabulary to the site. As I go through Graphics Atlas, I encourage you to sit back and enjoy the show and to try not to follow along with the website with me. You can return to this recording later and then try your own hand at the site at that time. Okay, so here we are at the Graphics Atlas homepage. There's sort of three sections or three modules. There's the guided tour, the compare, the identification. We also have past interesting pictures of the week. You can sign up for this weekly email in which we send you a really cool picture from our study collection. You can sign up here where it says subscribe. This has pictures of the week from past weeks as well as the current one. So you can enter any of these sections or modules by clicking on the tab or clicking down here on one of these pictures. I like to use the tabs. I like that. So I'm going to review the sort of basic functions of these modules, and some of these I'll swing back to and give more details about, but we'll kind of keep our method of looking in mind. So once we enter the module of our choice, in this case, we're going to start with guided tour. There's three ways of accessing the objects on the site. The first that we are shown is the browse, and this gives a list of everything on the site. They are divided into technology categories. So we have our pre-photographic or our traditional printmaking techniques. We have photomechanical, we have photographic, and finally we have digital. These are then further subdivided by process. So if I click on these, it'll drop down with each object within that process. The idea is that within each process there are variations, and so we tried to cover as many variations within each process as possible. Next, there's the search function. I'm going to circle back to this because this is the function we will mainly use to apply our ID methodology. So we'll come back to that. Next is our timeline. If you click on a process within the timeline, you can get a window that opens up and kind of shows you all the processes kind of within there. And you can actually access anything you want from the objects on the site from here as well. So we'll just go ahead and do that. And so here we are in our guided tour. The guided tour is exactly what it sounds like. We guide you on a tour through the object on the site. So we start by contextualizing the objects, putting them into, is it cultural context, social context, historical context? Why was this object made? Why is it important to show it to you? We follow this by features that are sort of specific to this object. We also show you features that are specific to the process. So most gelatin POP are kind of in this purple-red tonal range. With each image is accompanied by a verbal description that sort of describes why it looks the way that it looks, so that you understand why is it purple-red. We also talk about some deterioration issues, some other things like retouching, and then finally, sometimes we'll give you a layer structure so you kind of have an idea of how this thing is constructed. So if you remember the layer structures, we've actually cut up a photograph and imaged it so that we can show you kind of the stratification or, the layer structure of the object. Each of these images can be enlarged, so you can actually view these full screen, and the descriptions are still there, which is pretty cool. So let's move on to compare. If we move on to compare, we can compare this object to an object of the same process or a different process. So I'm gonna, let's see, compare it here. What we have in our compare is first we have this what to notice panel. This is kind of like what are the things that you should be looking for that are, again, those sort of key identifying features. What is it that's specific to this object that makes it a gelatin POP, for example? We also have this control panel down here. Oh, again, I should notice that the what to notice, you can jump right to that when you click it, so it gives you that view. Okay, then we have this control panel. You'll notice in the control panel, we have these 3 lighting angles. The lighting symbols are kind of the matches to the visual guide. If you remember, right, we have our 45 degree, we have our 0 degree specular light, and we have our 90 degree, that raking light. And this is kind of where we can start to apply our identification methodology. With the object view, we want the lowest level of magnification here. We want our 45 degree even illumination to get a sense of what can we observe of this object. We can then move to our 0 degree light where we get that specular, we get the surface sheen. So what are the surface characteristics? We can also use the video, right? And this kind of mimics that tilting the object back and forth and allowing the light to rake back and forth across it. So let's go back here. And then finally, we have our magnification view. As we click on these buttons, we can increase magnification. When we get here, sort of the third button from the right, this is equivalent to about 10x magnification. The next one is equivalent to about 30x magnification, right? So here's our loop, our low-powered pocket microscope, and then finally 50x magnification, our stronger, sort of more high-powered pocket microscope, or our stereo microscope. And then we can, again, change that lighting angle to include raking light, and that gives us our layer structure characteristics. And again, you can enlarge these images as well. So we can hit view full screen, and we can enlarge these, and we can go through all of these same lighting angles here. Additionally, we can look at the back of the object. Is there anything written or printed on the object that's significant? And we can look at the layer structure. Finally, we have our identification pages. We launched these new identification pages 2 years ago. Each has 5 sections. The overview, the object view, the surface view, and the magnification view. Does that sound familiar? Okay, and then finally we have variations. The overview gives common use states, alternate names. The alternate names aren't necessarily names that are ones you might want to use in your cataloging. Some of them also include proprietary names. So if you see a name like Aristotype, don't be surprised, right? That's a proprietary name, but the process is actually gelatin POP. We have processes that gelatin POP are commonly mistaken for. And we have what we call a sort of process family, like how can you kind of categorize the object, the materials, the technology. And finally, we have a description. And then, of course, in our object view, we have the things you would look for at that object view level that we described last month. What is the support? What is the image color or tone? Are there any image deterioration characteristics? So on. With the surface view, we're looking at surface sheen. Sheen and texture are related, so we also talk about texture, any deterioration that you might see, particularly with raking light or specular light. And then finally, our magnification view, right? Image structure, layer structure. And of course, we're always looking for any identifying deterioration. With each of these, we have a description of why it looks the way that it looks. And then, of course, we have our what to look for. That's kind of the Cliff Notes. Like, what do you really need to see? Of course, you can blow these up super huge too and see them really well. Going back to the object view, or the overview, rather, I missed, we have our key identifying features here too. So you can actually look at the key identifying feature and then jump right to where that is located within the rest of this part of the page. And then these, of course, are illustrated. Our key identifying features are illustrated down here too. So this is like the super quick version, and then you can explore more. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the compare. And now I'm going to return to our search function. So this is kind of the entry point for the site. And this is what we're going to use with our methodology. So let's do that. But first, I kind of want to talk about the search function and how it works and sort of how we came about it. So the search function is a filtered search. It's a lot like shopping online. What it's going to do is filter out objects that don't have the criteria that we're selecting. So every object in Graphics Atlas was keyworded with our controlled vocabulary. As we make our selections, the search is going to filter out objects that don't have those features. As you can see, the search is organized by object view, surface view, and magnification view. There's a few important features I really want to point out. First is, where are the visual guides? The visual guides are right here. You can click on the sort of blue PDF link that's next to the key identifying feature type. So the visual guide for color, image color, and tone is right there. We'll click on it, and what it does is it opens up a PDF. So just kind of quickly going back here, we can see that there's no guide for primary support. Hopefully you'll just know what your primary support is when you have the object on hand. Is it paper or is it plastic? You'll probably have a pretty good sense of that. But we do have guides for all of our other key identifying feature categories. So the guide opens up in this other window. You can download them, you can save them, you can print them. Keep in mind that the color accuracy may vary depending on your computer monitor calibration and your printer calibration. They can be rescaled so you can see the whole thing, or you can kind of zoom in to see an area of it a little bit closer. So yeah, there's the guides. Some are 2 pages, so be sure to kind of scroll to make sure you're seeing the whole thing. So the next thing I want to point out is that some key identifying features have a drop-down menu, which you can choose one vocabulary term, for example, primary support. Your primary support can only be one thing. It can be paper or it can be plastic, but it can't be both. So we would just select one of these. However, some have check boxes. So for example, with our image deterioration, an object might have more than one kind of deterioration. It can have highlight yellowing, and it might actually have image fading. So this allows us to sort of, select 2 things. Other categories like surface sheen and image structure have both a drop-down and check boxes. So something might be glossy and have differential gloss, but it can't be glossy and semi-matte. Like it can't be both, but it might be semi-matte and have differential gloss, or be glossy and have iridescence. Okay, so I'm going to hit clear again. Likewise, an image structure may appear continuous in tone, and at higher magnification, you might see image grain, or it can be continuous in tone and pigment particles are present. So that's how this works. So let's go back to our object examples, and we'll look at them, and based on the key identifying features, we'll select the search criteria that is appropriate. So here's our object examples. I'm going to toggle back and forth between this presentation and the website as we do this, so we can look at the objects, then we can select our criteria on the site. So here's our 4 examples that we used last month, and let's go through our methodology and see what they are. In the interest of time, we are only going to look at objects 1 and 3. If we have time, we'll do 2. Object 4 we already know is Woodbury type. If you remember from last month, it says Woodbury type right there. So I'm not super worried about that one. We know what that is. So let's start with our first object. With the object view, we're looking for the primary support material, image color, and if there's any deterioration that might actually be helpful for identification. We will also look at the image. So let's do that first. If you remember, she looks like a 19th century girl, and the format is a carte de visite. So right off the bat, we know we're looking for a 19th century process. With this object in hand, I can tell you that the primary support is paper. So let's toggle back to the website, and we're going to select paper as our primary support. Paper. So there you go. It's filtered out everything that doesn't have paper and given us only objects that have a paper support. But that gives us 169 results. So we need to keep going. So let's look at image color. Remember, we're using daylight balanced light, and we're isolating an area of the print in which there are good shadows and midtones. We determined by comparing our object to our key identifying, our visual identification guide, that the image color fell within this purple-red range. So when we looked at here at the kind of midtones, we went, okay, it's within this purple-red range. If we were to go to the site, we would click our visual guide here, which is already up, okay? She's in this purple-red range. So let's go ahead and select purple-red. Again, it's selected, or it's narrowed us down, but here we have 33 objects. But what I want you to notice is we're getting multiple objects from a single process. So we're actually narrowed down to 8 processes. Albumin, there's a bunch of those, some carbon, some collodion POP, so on and so forth. All of these definitely are objects which might fall into that purple-red range and be on a paper support. So now let's look for deterioration. If you remember, our object has some image fading around the edges, though it's not that bad. It also has some subtle highlight yellowing. Again, it may be hard for you to see that highlight yellowing in my picture, but the actual object in hand, when I held it up to a bright white piece of copier paper, the highlights were indeed yellow. So if we go back to Graphics Atlas, we can check highlight yellowing and image fading. If you're not sure that you see these characteristics, you can always leave these selections unknown. But once we click these, we're actually narrowed down to one process. This indeed is the correct answer. This object is indeed an albumin print. But I want to keep going. I want to go through the whole methodology with this object. And actually, let's pretend that I'm not super confident that the deterioration features are present because they are actually pretty subtle. So I'm going to go ahead and unclick those. So let's move on to surface view. So again, holding the flashlight about 4 inches above the print and looking down at the print so that my head is aligned with the flashlight, I can see the surface sheen of this object. So comparing our guide to the object, I feel like it's glossy. So here we have our glossy surface sheen, and here's our sheen on the object, and it's pretty glossy. That's sort of our best choice here. So going back to Graphics Atlas, we'll click glossy. Now let's look at this again. I don't see any iridescence. I would look at it with fluorescent lights. There's no iridescence. I don't see anything like differential gloss or bronzing or silver mirroring. So I'm not going to check any of those. Okay, so now we have 21 objects and 7 processes. So we're getting there, we're narrowing down. Now it's time for advanced ID. So let's bring out our advanced ID tools, your loupe and your pocket microscope. If you're using a loupe, remember to use it upside down, holding the cup to your eye, and use the flashlight to illuminate the print. I'm going to pull out my pocket microscope. First, I'm going to put down a piece of polyester sheeting to protect the surface of the print. The pocket microscope that Aaron, who's illustrated here, is using in this image has slightly higher magnification of about 50x. This is the one that I use. So the images that I'm going to show you are taken with this level of magnification of 50x. So let's compare this image, even illumination, 50x magnification, with the guide. Mine looks a lot like the first illustration at the top here. It's continuous in tone. I don't see any image grain, and I don't see pigment particles, and there's no pattern. I want to show you really quickly on here our image structure. If you remember, we have 3. We have one for 10x magnification, 30x magnification, and 50x magnification. There's 2 sides to each. So the second side will show you that image pattern. Keep scrolling and you get the 30x magnification. Keep scrolling, you get the 50x magnification. So comparing our object to the visual identification guide for image structure at 50x magnification, ours looks like this. I'm not seeing any dots, squares, or squiggles, or any of these other things. So let's go back. And we're going to select continuous in tone, and I'm not going to select image grain or pigment particles because I don't see that present. Now we have 20 results and 6 processes, so we're definitely getting there. Now let's see if we can determine layer structure. So remember, we're using our pocket microscope and raking light. Can we see paper fibers? And if so, where is the image in relation to the paper fibers? In this case, with raking light and 50x magnification, we see paper fibers. That's what these are, right? These random squiggly things that we see here are paper fibers. Remember to practice. Look at plain pieces of paper of differing textures and thicknesses. Use magnification and raking light to train your eye so that you know what paper fibers look like, so you know what you're looking for. Anytime we look at things with magnification, everything looks like totally wild. So practice, practice, practice. Now we need to determine where the image is in relation to the paper fibers. So let's look at our guide for layer structure. I'm showing you a detail of the guide here. So since we see paper fibers, let's decide where they are. Let's see where the image is. Is the image in the paper support, or is it suspended above the paper support in a binder? In our case, I believe the image is above the fibers in the binder. So let's go back and make that choice. That's our second choice. Okay. And again, remember, this can be difficult, so we can look at areas where there might be damage and so on and so forth to see if we can get an idea of layer structure. But once we've selected this, we now have 3 processes: albumin, toned silver gelatin, and a Woodbury type. Okay, now let's go to our timeline. We said that this was a 19th century girl. So our albumin process falls within the 19th century, 1860s to the mid-1890s. Our silver gelatin developed out process and the toned, it begins in the 1890s and goes to the 2000s. If we were to look at the identification for this, we would read that while it was introduced in the 1890s, it actually wasn't super popular into the 20th century, the early 20th century. and that our selenium toning wasn't really popular until the mid-20th century, to like the 1950s and 1960s. So with a little bit of work, we can actually rule that out. Now let's look at Woodbury type. Okay, Woodbury type falls within the 19th century. This is within the date range that we're expecting to see. So Woodbury type and albumin prints are possible. So let's go back to our search and we can select these options. Unfortunately, we can't select two options here, but we can remember, we can write down what our search options, what our results were. So I'm going to select cabinet card. Okay, and now I'm going to add Woodbury type. Okay. And now we can use our compare and we can sort of look with the different levels of the different sort of light sources, different levels of magnification, and go through our ID methodology in our heads as we look at this. So we can agree that they're both within that sort of purple-red image tonal range. We can look here with our specular light, with our surface view. Oh, we notice that this actually has differential gloss, which here we've called image relief, but it's the same, right? Okay, well, our object didn't have that. We can then increase magnification and look with our magnification view, and we'll notice that this one has pigment particles, and ours does not, right? The albumin print does not. You can also use the guided tour to learn more about the albumin print and see if you feel like this works for you, or you can go to the identification page for albumin print and see if your object kind of matches the characteristics and the key identifying features of the albumin print. Okay, so let's go back to our compare. Let's go back to search and let's clear. I want to go through the same exercise with example 4. I'm going to go a little bit faster because now that we have the hang of this, it'll be a little bit easier. So let's look at the object view for object number 4. What do we want to notice? The first thing we want to notice is, you got it, what is the support, right? We have a paper support. We can see that it's mounted to a secondary support. So since it's mounted, it's probably paper. Okay, with this object on hand, you'll have a pretty good sense what this object is. It's on paper. Next, we want to compare it to our visual guide for image color. And again, if you remember from last time, we've determined that all of our object examples are within this purple-red range. Now again, remember, it's always important to look at it with daylight balanced light, because the different colors of light, whether it's tungsten or if it's fluorescent lights, that's going to shift what you perceive as being the image color. So with daylight balanced light, we say, okay, yeah, it's within this purple-red range. So when we go back to our search function, we can select those. Again, we're back where we started before with our 33 results. So let's keep going. We want to move on to our surface sheen. Comparing the sheen that we see here, again, I'm looking at it with that flashlight about 4 inches above the surface, and I'm getting that ball of light in the center of the print. When we compare the size and shape of the ball of light, kind of the way it looks with our surface sheen guide, we can see that it looks glossy. It's not quite as well defined as what we have in our high gloss. Remember, our high gloss is typically a metal support or a plastic support. So ours looks glossy. I feel like I can confidently say it's within this range. So we can go back, we can choose glossy. And again, I've looked at this object with fluorescent lighting and I did not see any iridescence. I also never saw any mirroring or bronzing, and I did not see differential gloss. So those things are not present. If they were present, I would show them to you. No tricks here. So now we're going to go to our advanced ID and we're going to look at the magnification view. Here, the first thing we want to look for is image structure. Is it continuous in tone, or is there a pattern to it? Do we see image grain? Are there pigment particles present? So with 50x magnification and even illumination, remember we have our 45-degree illumination. This is our reminder here on the guide. We can see that our image is actually continuous in tone. So we can compare this to these and it looks pretty continuous in tone. I'm not really seeing a lot of image grain, maybe a little bit, but not much. And I don't see any pigment particles. Now, I know you're looking at this saying, yeah, but what's that? So these are actually different things. It's retouching on the surface of the print, and in some cases it's accretions. And accretions can be anything from like insect poop, for example, or just stuff that's sort of fallen and adhered to the surface. And again, with practice, you'll begin to recognize the difference between pigment particles that are kind of in the binder and stuff that's on the surface. But practice, 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 and keep looking. So we're going to go here, we're going to click continuous in tone. Okay, so now we have 20 results. Now let's go back and let's look at our layer structure. With raking light and magnification, I can see that the paper fibers are obscured. We'll compare it to our guide. And again, this is our vocabulary here that's visually defined. So I do see abrasions here, right? These are all abrasions, but I don't see paper fibers. Now, it's easy to confuse abrasions like these with paper fibers, but just remember to keep practicing and keep looking and just look at plain pieces of paper. So let's go back and we can click that the image is in the binder and the paper fibers are obscured. I'm going to open up the guide for that, for the layer structure, so we can look at it a little more clearly. And I can kind of zoom in on this area that we think is right and go, okay, yeah, I agree with that. Our object looks a lot more like these. Okay. So with that, we have 13 results, but actually only 3 processes. So we have a carbon print, collodion POP, and gelatin POP. So we can quickly go to compare, and we can notice that the carbon print has differential gloss and it has pigment particles. And so we'll be able to rule that one out. So we can look at the carbon print and go, okay, well, there's only one option under carbon print with these characteristics. We can look at it quickly. We can rule it out. This isn't it. And so what we're left with is collodion POP and gelatin POP. And these two processes are really difficult to distinguish from one another. The compare feature may not be super helpful here because the processes are so similar. So this is where we have to do a little bit more reading. And this is where we're actually going to go to the identification page. So I'll select one and I'll go to the identification page. So in reading these pages, we'll do a little bit of research and we'll find out that the collodion binder better protects the silver image from fading. So collodion POP are often in better condition. And indeed, in our key identifying features, we have good image tone, little fading. However, collodion POP do fade, and there is such thing as a gelatin POP in good condition. Our image, our object, looks really good with no visible or extreme fading. We'll also learn that collodion POP sometimes, but not always, have an iridescent color to the sheen, right? So here it says iridescence may be visible. So we can also sort of research about that. And again, I've looked at the color of the sheen under fluorescent lighting, and there's no iridescence to the sheen. So in the end, our object is either collodion or gelatin POP, and I'm honestly not 100% sure which, but I'm going to be leaning towards collodion POP because of the stability of the object. And so if we go here and we jump to the object view, we'll scroll down and we'll learn about image color and tone, kind of what that typically looks like. And then we can also go down to the deterioration. Here we see, we'll read here why it looks the way that it looks, and then kind of our what to look for, right, our Cliff's Notes, as well as what's illustrated. And we'll find out that typically the collodion POP look pretty good, but sometimes they can look like this, and sometimes they can look quite bad like this. Yeah, that looks terrible. So there you have it. Even the experts aren't always sure, and that's okay. So let's return to search and clear. We only have about 5 minutes left, but I don't want to leave you with a total cliffhanger. So really quickly, let's walk through this object and we'll identify it. So let's just walk through it in the PowerPoint and then we'll select our criteria on the site. So we have our object view. What we'll notice is, first thing we'll look at the image. These kids look 20th century to me. I'm looking at the hairstyles, I'm looking at the clothing, and they're screaming mid 20th century. I'm going to look at an area with good shadows and good sort of deep midtones. I'm going to compare it to the image color guide, and I'm going to say, heck yeah, it's purple red. Again, don't stress about the image color. Use the daylight balance light and use your gut, okay? And make it the best choice. Make your best choice. The next thing I'm also going to notice is these folks don't appear to have any image deterioration. This thing looks as good as the day it was made. So, okay, so we have, and it's a paper support, right? It's a print, I know it's on a paper support. We'll look at the surface view, we'll compare it to our guide. This sheen here matches really closely to our semi-matte. I hope that you see that. It doesn't appear glossy to me, it's definitely not high gloss, and it's definitely not super matte. It's in this sort of semi-matte range. Okay. Magnification. Bringing out my pocket microscope, my even illumination, it's continuous in tone. There's no particles, there's no pigment particles, there's no grain, and there's definitely no pattern. It's continuous in tone. It looks like these. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use my pocket microscope with raking light, and I'm going to determine if I can see the paper fibers and where the image is in relationship to the paper fibers. Okay, remember from last month, this one was tricky. We can kind of see the paper fibers. They're not super obvious, but they're not totally obscured. Right here, okay? This kind of thing. They almost look like veins, like slightly protruding under skin, if you will. Some of you may think that you don't see the paper fibers and you might be leaning towards our third vocabulary option. That's okay. If you remember from our 20th century lecture, 20th century prints have all sorts of different layer structures. The same process will have all sorts of different layer structures to give different visual characteristics. So this doesn't surprise me that this is kind of iffy, but my gut feeling is telling me that I do see the paper fibers, even if slightly, and the image is above the paper fibers in the binder. So let's go back here and let's select those criteria. Paper fibers, purple red, semi-matte, continuous in tone. I can see them and it's definitely above. So now we have 11 results found, but only, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 processes. This is the point of the search function. It's not going to give you the exact one right answer every time. We're not going to narrow down to one answer. What we're going to do is we're going to narrow down to 2, 3, or 4 options, right? That's the best that we can do because each process has all those different variations. But this is where our timeline comes in handy. If you remember, we said that this picture was solidly mid 20th century. These kids are 20th century kids. So looking at the timelines, let's remember this: albumin, carbon, matte collodion, silver gelatin. Looking at the timeline, we'll remember our albumin process is mid to late 19th century rather. So we'll get rid of that. Okay, now let's look at our matte collodion. That was another option. Matte collodion was only used between 1893 and 1910, right? Really, really short period of time at the turn of the last century. Well, we said these were solidly mid-20th century kids, so we can rule this out. No, now I can't remember. Oops, sorry, I messed up. Let's go back to our search. Okay, then the other one was carbon. So again, carbon was also, oh, where is it? Here it is. Carbon was also kind of mid 19th century through to the mid 20th century. Maybe. If we read a little bit more about the carbon process, we'll actually learn that its kind of heyday for portraiture was kind of more mid to late 19th century. So that kind of leaves us with silver gelatin developed out prints. And so that was our 20th century. Now remember, silver gelatin developed out was the most popular process of the 20th century. If you were to have a photograph from the mid 20th century and you guessed silver gelatin developed out, you would probably be right. But we can look at our object on Graphics Atlas and we can compare it with the objects that we have in hand and we can make that identification for sure. So definitely our selenium tone silver gelatin is within that purple red range. Now, don't get thrown off that this is a stereo view. The stereo view is the format. The format is just really what it is. Any process can actually be mounted to a stereo view or made into a stereo view. The same as any process can be mounted to a carte de visite or a cabinet card. It gives the format gives us a little bit more information about the object, what was its purpose, but it doesn't really tell us anything about the process. So ignore the format and really look at the characteristics of the print itself. And so our object here indeed is selenium tone silver gelatin developed out print. Okay, thank you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. Thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities, Division of Preservation and Access for funding this webinar series. Thanks to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for funding the research that went into Graphics Atlas. Our next webinar is February 14th, Valentine's Day, at the same time, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that one will be about how do we use identification to improve collection preservation and collection access. So I will take some time to answer questions. And when you close out, a survey will pop up. It's really short. Please, please, please answer the survey and give us your feedback. We're also teaching this in a series of workshops, so anything that we can do better to improve the tool or to improve the way that we present it is definitely helpful. Okay. So the first one is, I gotta take off my glasses. Does the search bar and the timeline are specific to USA historical context? Let's go back to Graphics Atlas. And we'll go back to our search. The timeline probably is US centric for the most part. I would say it's actually probably pretty universal. There's a couple instances where I would say it's US centric, and that would be the daguerreotype. The daguerreotype was popular into the 1860s in the United States, but the length of time that it was used in Europe is shorter than that. It was really maybe 1850s. Other processes, though, with the timeline, I think are fairly international, if you will. What we call the processes, right, our nomenclature for process is probably pretty US-centric. For example, ambrotype is a word that we use in the US, tintype is used in the US, whereas they might be wet collodion positives or ferrotypes in Europe. But the search function, this is vocabulary that we came up with at IPI, but also looking to our colleagues within the field, what terms are being used to describe characteristics that are specific to photographs. How do we describe photographs? So I would say that this is fairly international. You know, the color purple is the color purple, whether you're in the United States or you're in France. You know, a glossy surface sheen, once we visually defined it, that's what we mean by glossy. Okay, so that's where the guides come in handy. What do I mean by glossy? Look at the guide, it's visually defined. Now you can compare your object to the guide. So I hope that helps. Okay, the next question. What, if anything, do you suggest to do about the accretions? I'm not a conservator, so I say leave them alone. I would actually suggest consulting with a conservator. If it depends on your collection, you know, if you're in a fine art collection and you feel like the accretions are taking away from the intent of the artist, you might ask a conservator to remove them. There are ways to remove them. You know, and accretions are Often it actually comes from insects. So yeah, I don't really know how to remove them personally. So I don't know if that helps. Next question is, what about prints which have been sprayed with lacquer or laminated? Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not exactly sure what exactly you're asking, but the lacquer on the lamination will change the surface characteristics, and that's the purpose of a laminate or a lacquer, is to change the surface sheen characteristics. I'm not necessarily going to have something on Graphics Atlas that's an exact match to your object. And that's definitely the limitation of our search function. I can only keyword things that are in Graphics Atlas. So if I don't have an exact match, it may not necessarily come up with anything. But I've done my best to expand the keywords so that most objects will hit the mark. When it comes to lacquers and laminates, it's difficult. You know, I know that sometimes salted paper prints were waxed. I don't have a wax salted paper print on here. So in that case, if you know that it has a surface that's been altered with an applied lacquer or an applied laminate, you might want to just not select a surface sheen, right? You can get pretty far with some of these other visual characteristics, right? Some of these other key identifying characteristics. Really, if you're not sure, you think it's been altered in any way, you can always opt out of selecting something. You don't have to select something. Okay, the next question is, do you sell the guides? If there's a concern over color calibration. Yeah, we are concerned about color calibration, and this whole search function and the guides are actually fairly new. We just launched them a few months ago, and our plan is actually to have guides produced to sell so that you can be sure that you have the color accuracy. So we'll sell them as like a little packet. And again, you know, we're a not-for-profit, so we'll probably sell them pretty close to a cost of what it costs to print them and to make them. So they'll be affordable. But that's definitely something that we are looking forward to in the very near future. So keep your eyes and ears peeled. The next question is, if the use of this methodology for identification is not enough to identify a photograph or process variation that are the cases in which it is necessary to use instrumental analysis characterization, such as XRF and FTIR. I think that unless you're a conservator, for most applications, I'm hoping and I feel like this will narrow you down close enough to a process. Again, it's going to narrow you down to 2 or 3 options, 4 options maybe, and that's where you just have to do the work. You have to put the work into using the compare function, using the guided tour, using the identification to learn a little bit more about the process so you can make an informed decision about the process. If you're going to approach it with a conservation treatment, and you're not sure, for example, if it's collodion or gelatin, yeah, you might want to use FTIR, which will give you what the sort of organic properties are of, you know, of the binder. It'll, you know, if you know how to use FTIR or Raman spectroscopy, that'll tell you sort of the organic that'll show sort of the organic composition. This is a specialized skill and requires specialized equipment. So you need to have access to someone who can do it and someone who can actually read the spectra. Reading the spectra is like the hardest part. And the reason being is, you know, collodion will actually dissolve in most solvents, whereas gelatin won't, but gelatin will absorb a lot of water and swell and it'll change the surface characteristics. But otherwise, for your cataloging purposes, if you've narrowed it down to collodion or gelatin POP, that's as good as you're going to get, you know? And then you can just use that sort of gut feeling, right? Does your gut tell you gelatin or collodion? You know, or, you know, I don't know, you know, if you're in an art collection, sometimes you want to see, does it have a gum arabic binder? You know, is it gum bichromate or something? But again, these aren't tools that are accessible to everyone. So yeah, I mean, if you have access to it, why not use it? But I think the search function can get you close. What are the acronyms for FTIR? Fourier transfer infrared. There you go. Again, this is really, really specialized equipment, specialized skills to be able to operate it and to use it. These are used by chemists and conservation scientists. Okay, what would you consider including or would you consider including a key set of known identified photographs or photographic samples with the color calibrated printouts to test our accurate identifications? Yeah, this is something we've considered. It's just the time and energy put into putting it together. There are some identification box sets that were put out by, I think the Foundation for the American Institute for Conservation, FAIC, has a set. The Metropolitan Museum of Art also somewhere in there produced a set of prints. So they're printed by the foundation or by the Met, and they're identified. In our case, we would probably pull from our study collection and make kind of identification sets from our study collection. Some things are not very common or more difficult to find, so that's something we've considered, but again, there's so many variations within each process. Albumin prints can run from a very subtle semi-matte to glossy. Anything in the 20th century, there's immense amount of variation, and whole dissertations have gone into characterizing silver gelatin developed out papers. If we were to make such a set, it would have to include a wide variety of these variations, I would think. So it starts to, right, you could see how it starts to like get a little out of hand and overwhelming, but it's definitely something we've considered, and I appreciate your suggestion because that kind of confirms in my mind maybe that's something we need to do. Okay. I'll just add, if for any reason, any function on Graphics Atlas doesn't work, somebody said the video doesn't work in Chrome, you might have to use a different search or a different internet thing. Like, I use Firefox, it works for me. I don't know what the deal is with Chrome. You might also have to use the plugin. Do they use Flash, Lauren? Yeah, they use Flash, so you have to have Flash for it to work. I'm totally aware that Flash is like, it was the thing to use when we made the site, and now it's like on its way out the door. So, we'll always be dealing with technology challenges, but yeah, you'll definitely need Flash, and you might need a different browser, but all of these things work. They work for me, so they should work for you. Okay, I think that's it for the questions, and see anything else. Yeah, thanks so much for coming. And if you have any additional questions, you can send us an email. All right, thanks.